If I had to select one anthem as the most played one in the world, it would have to be the Star-Spangled Banner. The American anthem and the flag it honours are so tightly woven into the country's culture that no event or gathering is too small for a playing of the anthem. That can astonish visitors from other countries where anthems are rarely played. So how did that come to be? And why did this one song beat out some pretty strong contenders for the title of US National Anthem? We're about to take a close look at the history of the Star-Spangled Banner. Welcome to another episode of this series on national anthems, the worst songs in the world. My name is David Pate. I'm a broadcaster, writer and journalist in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I'm joined for this episode by the author of the New York Times bestseller, Oh Say Can You Hear? A Cultural Biography of the Star-Spangled Banner. Mark Clague is a professor of musicology at the School of Music, Theatre and Dance at the University of Michigan. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks so much, David. I'm excited to be here.
I wanted to start out by asking about the anthem, your connection to it, why you decided to write a book about it.
Well, there's sort of two reasons. One is that I teach a first-year musicology class focused on music of the United States of America. And one of the questions is, what is music of the United States of America? And I figured that national anthem must be American music. So we wanted to sort of unpack what that would mean. And I played Jimi Hendrix's performance from Woodstock in 1969 for the class. And that raised all sorts of questions about what is patriotism? What's the appropriateness of protest? Where did this song come from? What are the words? Who wrote them? When? Why? And so it was in part answering those questions of my students that led me down this, what turned out to be a much more sort of deep exploration than I was anticipating. The other reason is pretty personal, I think. I mean, I was 9 years old in 1976, which is when the United States celebrated its bicentennial birthday, 200 years. And, that was a time of sort of, real consumerism and optimism. And I think there was a lot of ideology that sort of was ignoring it was a happy celebration of patriotism in America. And I sort of bought into that as a kid. And as I have grown up and sort of, become more and more aware of the tensions in American society and the way in which music serves as a vehicle for expressing, personal identity, issues, politics, it really raised a question about my own relationship to the anthem. What did I really feel about this song? I mean, I love this song because when I was a 9-year-old kid, I sort of bought into this song, but where that energy came from and what it meant, how does the way that the music touches us emotionally then interact with our intellectual understanding of the history of the nation, and as you become sort of a voter and you get involved in politics, and so much of our life today, the news is dominated by these existential battles between Democratic, senators and Republican congressmen these days. So those kind of ideas really resonate with the anthem in ways that I just wanted to understand better.
And that's the thing about anthems. They are things that are part of our lives. We don't really question why we have them or what they mean. We're just so used to them and familiar with them. So they kind of bore themselves inside us and become part of our national identity, do you think?
That's a great observation. Yeah, I think it's repetition, it's ritual, it's the ubiquity of anthems, particularly in the United States, which we seem to be obsessed with the Star-Spangled Banner in so many ways, that seem to make it feel like a natural, always been there, true part of the American experience. And of course, it's not true at all. It's a cultural construct. It's something that was composed and written. It had a very specific, political angle when it was written, and it's been used, sort of as both a symbol of unity and a weapon of disunity throughout its history. So I think, it's interesting how anthems are constructed, and yet we're sort of told to feel that they're natural.
Some anthems are deliberately written, whether by competition or because they're being commissioned as anthems, but that's not the case with the Star Spangled Banner. Tell me how it all started.
So the Star-Spangled Banner was written between September 14th and 16th in 1814, following the Battle of Baltimore, which was a battle in the War of 1812. Tends not to get a lot of play in American history courses because it was a war basically with England and Canada. None of the boundaries of the United States politically changed. The geography was the same. So it all went back to the way it was. And so it tends not to get a lot of attention. But it was a really important war in American sort of sensibility, because it's sort of, I think of it as a time when the idea of the nation, as a unified whole was born. Patriotism itself, sort of took fire after the War of 1812. Symbols like Uncle Sam and the flag become much more important after that, and certainly Francis Scott Key's song. So he wrote a set of lyrics to fit a pre-existing tune while he was stuck aboard an American truce ship in the Patapsco River, having observed the British attack on Fort McHenry, which is the fort that guards the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. So had that fort fallen to British bombardment, then the British Navy would have been able to sort of go into Baltimore Harbor and then attack the defensive lines for the city from behind, and that would have allowed a land assault to succeed. Instead, the Navy was kept out of the harbor, and the land assault, just failed. The British decided it was too costly to attack in hand-to-hand combat, and so they pulled back, and the city was saved. And for Francis Scott Key, this was a moment of sort of divine intervention. This was saving of American identity, saving of the country, and he memorialized that in a song that was originally called "The Defense of Fort McHenry" and really celebrated the heroism of the American militia and soldiers who basically stayed in the fort when they were sitting ducks, because the British gunships were far superior to the American cannon defending the fort, and but they held their ground despite sort of overwhelming odds.
You said there how Francis Scott Key wrote this as a song, and that's an important distinction because a lot of people think it's a poem to a pre-existing tune, but that pre-existing tune has kind of an interesting background too. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so when the early printings of the anthem, look like a poem because they're just words, and there was this tune that everybody already knew. It was a tune in popular culture, like Yankee Doodle, like Hail Columbia. There was a tune called Anacreon in Heaven, and Anacreon in Heaven is, ironically, maybe a British tune. It was written in London around 1773 as the anthem for an amateur musicians club. Sort of like a bourgeois, sort of entry into sort of all male club. They were merchants, fairly wealthy, but they also had musicians as honorary members, including, singers who were sort of the Broadway variety. So London's West End and sort of early musical theater. And so there were some very excellent singers in this club, and they wanted to show off what excellent musicians they were. So they wrote a theme song that's actually quite difficult to sing. It has all these high notes. It's quite athletic and upbeat. It celebrates the sort of joy and the conviviality, the sociality of this men's music club. And that tune gets brought over to the United States by a group of actors in around 1793. And they're sort of using it as part of a variety show skit, partially mocking the British elite, but also, sort of creating a ritual with the crowd. So one of the interesting things about the song is it's a kind of call and response song originally. So the way we sing the Star-Spangled Banner today is not the way it was sung in 1814. In 1814, it would have been sung by a soloist who was pretty talented and could hit all those high notes. And then the last two lines, so "Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave," would have been echoed back by the crowd who was listening to the song. So that was the same way that the club anthem worked. So a singer, representing the club, or the president of the club, would sing the verse, and then the membership of the club would echo back the last two lines. And that sort of call and response fit into political discourse in early America. It was a way of sort of recruiting support. So you could write, for instance, a campaign song to this tune and sort of say, hey, our candidate's great, go vote for a candidate, and then the crowd echoes back, our candidate's great, let's go vote for our candidate, right? So it has a kind of political discourse about building community that made it a very natural tune for political discourse in early American society. So actually that use of it in American politics and popular culture predates Francis Scott Key's writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. So this was like a super typical thing in English and American culture at this time, this sort of writing new lyrics to old tunes to talk about contemporary events. And so when Francis Scott Key picked that tune, which he already knew, and we know that for a couple of reasons. One is that he'd written a previous set of lyrics to exactly the same melody called When the Warrior Returns, which is about the Tripolitan War and in 1805. And so, he's sort of doing the obvious thing. It's not, it makes, it's sort of weird. We only remember sort of this one tune, this one song from this era, but there were hundreds written to the same melody. Another great example actually is My Country 'Tis the Sea, My Country 'Tis the Sea, Sweet Land of Liberty, which is God Save Our Glorious King, right? So it's actually the what's now the British national anthem. That same melody became the tune that new words were written to create an American patriotic song. So this was super common in the 19th century.
He also presumably chose that tune because it was so well known in the hopes that people would pick up on the words. But did he have any intent? Do we know if he had any intent that this would become anything more than a passing fancy?
I don't think so. I mean, these were topical ballads. They were tied to very specific events. There were actually dozens of other songs written during the War of 1812 using exactly the same melody, all about the War of 1812. So, I mean, I think he certainly spoke later in his life about being proud of how successful his song had been because it did survive sort of the event to gain further symbolic power. But that was the exception, not the rule. And I don't think you can really plan to write an anthem. I think, historically, there are certainly times when countries have said, well, we need an anthem and, we're going to commission one. You know more about this than I do. But, in the United States and certainly the early history of anthems, they tend to be songs that through sort of historical accident sort of catch fire and they stick around and they get repeated and used in ritual. And then it's sort of the obvious choice as anthem. And I think that's what happened to Francis Scott Key's song. I think he was trying to write a political song that would bring people together. It's intentionally a political song to create unity in a divided nation because the two parties that were at war in the War of 1812 in the United States was the Federalist Party, which Key was a member of, which was the pro-British party that was against the war, and then the Democratic Republicans, which were the pro-French party that was very much for the war. So there's a huge time of division in the United States in 1814, not unlike today. And Francis Scott Key sort of saw, hey, we're all being attacked. We need to come together and unify because actually, as a country, we're pretty weak. The British have burned Washington, D.C. to the ground the month before. I mean, they're harassing Baltimore. We can't do anything about it. Our Navy, is not very good. Their Navy is the superpower of the seas. We need to come together. And so there's a lot about the anthem text if you look at it, because it, I sort of, in the book, I talk about the most important word for me in the Star-Spangled Banner is the word you, O say, can you see? Because it sort of recruits the singer today into the story. But if you look at how those pronouns change throughout the song, you'll see like the fourth verse is, oh, thus may it ever, when free men shall stand between their left homes and the war's desolation. All the pronouns turn to we's and they's and us's. So it actually sort of turns an individual into a citizen, into a member of the nation. If you track how the pronouns work in the anthem, it's pretty cool.
You introduced there the fourth verse because a lot of people are not aware there's more than one verse to this song. It was originally four verses. So what's in the stuff that we don't sing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There are four verses, and in fact, people have written extra alternate verses. So the four verses sort of tell the story of the bombardment of Fort McHenry. It starts out saying, is our flag still there? It's literally asking, like, have the British taken the fort? Because if the British won, then they would run up their own flag up the flagpole. And so it would be a signal that the fort had fallen and the British were now in control. And so that what the sort of nature of the flag flying above the fort for Key is the sort of critical poetic conceit of all four verses. And so that's why the flag becomes so prominent in the lyric. But the second verse sort of talks about the land assault, on the shore dimly seen. The third verse, really sort of vilifies the British enemy. and sort of mocks them for their wanting to attack Baltimore, which, for key had women and children in it. Controversially has the word slave in it, which is something that I try to unpack in the book. And the fourth verse is sort of a optimistic, we've won this battle. This is a sign of us all coming together. And from here forth, Americans need to be willing to rise up and defend the nation. So there is a narrative trajectory to each verse, like the high notes make a kind of climax, and then each verse tells a part of the story, and then the four verses together tell a larger story.
At what point did it switch from being a four-verse song to just the single verse that everybody hears today?
That's a great question. So in the run up to World War One is where you stop having the Star Spangled Banner sung as a song by a soloist, echoed back by the crowd, and have it be a song that the whole community sings together. So you stop having that choral, echo, that choral repeat, because if everybody's singing it together, there's no reason to sing the last two lines together twice. So that tradition falls out. But it becomes part of what's called the community singing movement, and part of, sort of the pernicious rhetoric of World War One, and sort of, forcing people to come together, and against Germany in large part. So it's really at that time that when you sing it all together, it's you're using it in civic ritual. You don't want to spend all the time to sing all four verses, and it's sort of ends up getting repeated much more frequently. And I think at that point they stop singing these extra verses, and you just sing the first.
The song itself didn't immediately become a smash hit. As you said, there are many, many other uses of that song. But when did it become cemented as the anthem? I know it wasn't officially declared an anthem until 1931, but it was clearly the anthem long before that, or it had won the battle. What were the other songs that were in contention, and why did the Star Spangled Banner win out?
Yeah, there are a bunch of other songs. Hail Columbia was probably the closest thing to a national anthem prior to Francis Scott Key's Star Spangled Banner sort of taking over. It was originally a tune written for the George Washington that got words. There, I think, sort of three reasons why the Star Spangled Banner wins out, and part of it is its moment of creation, like this moment of patriotic fervor that happens in the War of 1812, because America is able to kick the British off our shores. The Battle of New Orleans in 1815 sort of ends the war. I think there's the music, which you brought up earlier, is a really important part of its success. I think today a lot of people talk about America the Beautiful as an alternative to the Star Spangled Banner. It was certainly considered as a possible candidate in 1931. America the Beautiful works great. It's sort of a much calmer song, much less militaristic and aggressive. And it works really great at times of peace. But the history of the Star Spangled Banner really is a history of song at war. And so at those moments of sort of national crisis, when you have to inspire people to volunteer for a militia to go put their lives on the line, the sort of athletic virility of the melody of the Star Spangled Banner, I think is an important part of its function. But the biggest thing, I think, is the U.S. Civil War. So the U.S. Civil War in 1861, the big controversy is whether the Confederate States can succeed, right, or secede rather, and they, basically the federal government decides it's illegal to secede, and therefore you have to stay in the nation. And so, in the United States, really from the War of 1812 and the Battle of Baltimore forward, the number of stars on the flag has always been equivalent with the number of states, right? So the flag becomes sort of the symbol of all the states together, and so the flag became the symbol of union, right? So the Northern Army, under Lincoln's command, uses the Star Spangled Banner, the flag, as its symbol of its rallying cry. And the Star Spangled Banner, the song, becomes the oral equivalent of that. It becomes literally the song that the Union Army is using for recruiting. Soldiers, bunking in the Capitol are singing the last two lines of the Star Spangled Banner to sort of rouse themselves to courage. And so that song becomes sacred because of the sacrifice of blood to preserve the nation and end slavery. And so I think it's really the Civil War that makes it into the national symbol, and what through social practice becomes the national anthem. It's not official till 1931, but it was really the only obvious choice by the time they got around to making it official. So one of the things about anthems, at least the history of the Star Spangled Banner tells us, it's really the community, the people, through their use of a song, that determine the anthem. It's not so much a government bill that decides what the anthem is.
is very much attached to community, because I think one thing that many visitors to the United States are always amazed about is how often it's sung. I mean, it's sung at not just at major sporting events, it's sung at high school football games. It seems that there cannot be an event in the US at the smallest level without a performance of the anthem, which I think, in my experience anyway, is unique to the United States. Why did it become so attached to so much of daily life?
No, that's a great question, and I don't think anybody probably has the total answer to that. I mean, I'm always amazed. I'll be doing like a 5K run in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I live, and there'll be a trumpet player who plays the anthem before the runners can run off. And it does. I totally agree with you. It seems like the anthem is ubiquitous and everywhere, which is part of the reason why I wanted to write about it, because I think it's such an important, sort of unrecognized part of American culture. And but I think part of that intensity goes back to sort of the marriage of the anthem and sports. So probably the most frequent time I hear the anthem is at U.S. sporting events. Football games here on the University of Michigan campus are a pretty big deal, and we always play the anthem before the game. And that's pretty typical in all American sports. And it really has gone down to the point, as you say, where every practically junior high school or high school game will have the anthem as well. And that actually, the very first time the anthem was played for a professional sporting event in the United States was, as far as I can tell, May 15th, 1862, which was during the U.S. Civil War. Again, this time when the song becomes so urgent. And it was used at a baseball game in Brooklyn, New York. But the anthem was pretty rare in the 19th century because in order to have an anthem, there's no recording, there's no amplifiers and loudspeakers, and so if you're going to have the anthem played, you have to either sing it or have a band, a live group of musicians, and so it's relatively expensive and special to hear the anthem outside of, like, say, opening day or the World Series early on. What really changes it is actually the every game anthem as we know it today is a phenomenon that anticipates World War II. And so in 1940, I think that with the storm clouds rising in Europe, there's a lot of anxiety in the United States. And, I would have thought that the bombing of Pearl Harbor is what ignited the Every Game Anthem. But as I did my research, I was surprised to see that, it was really the year or two earlier that the anthem becomes more and more common. And in fact, there are, complaints in 1940 that, the baseball announcers need to replace the record album they're using to play the anthem because it's getting so worn out because they play it every single game. So that's the very first time you hear about, like, the every game anthem in American history. And I think what happens in between to change that is World War One. So in World War One, professional sports in the United States were declared a non-essential profession. It was not important. So during the rationing of World War One, the mobilization of the country, if you were a man of fighting age and you had to be employed in a war relevant profession, and it was determined that baseball, which was already a big professional sport in World War One, was not that. And so baseball stars all got drafted into the army. Baseball was about to collapse as a profession, and what saved it was basically how quickly the United States involvement in the war ended. So they get involved in 1917. By 1918, the war's over. So the baseball season is sort of saved. When World War II rolls around, professional sports is not going to make the same mistake. And so they very consciously build patriotic ritual into American sports to make professional sports sort of part of the battle for hearts and mind and morale on the home front. And in World War II, professional sports in the United States is declared an essential part of the war effort. And so professional sports, baseball and football, is just starting to become important. Then boxing is very important. Car racing, like all those things would have been subject to rationing for gasoline and tires and that kind of thing. And that did not happen in World War II because professional sports protected its own economic interests by asserting that it was part of the war effort. And so at the end of World War II, the commissioner of the NFL meets with the president and gives him a golden ticket to any sporting event and says, Mr. President, we are going to play the anthem at every game from here on out because it's been so successful during the war. And we're not going to make this just a wartime thing. This can be an all-time thing.
And there does seem to be a very close connection between the military and the anthem. You see, certainly at all the large events, there's a very big tie-in. You'll see members of the military on the field, often a military band. You'll see a fly past. I mean, the classic example would be the Whitney Houston performance, which is probably the pinnacle of of everything. It's got everything. It's got the fly past. It's got the colors. It's got the smoke. The whole thing going on. Uh, but why is that? I mean, you mentioned earlier about how America the Beautiful is a more peaceful and relaxed anthem, but because America's been at war for so much of its existence in various parts of the world, it's a more militaristic tune that fits the nation better. So why why is that connection with the military and the anthem so strong?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is, and when I give talks, a lot of times military veterans or members of the military will ask questions at the end, and it's the Star Spangled Banner is played a lot in military ritual on bases, and it's partially to galvanize that patriotic devotion to nation, right? I mean, I think the ultimate sacrifice is being asked to put your life on the line for the country, and countries do this constantly, right? And the United States has been at war constantly. So this question of life and death, and give me liberty, give me death, the kind of Patrick Henry quote that's so famous. That's where the emotion, the willingness to put yourself in harm's way for the good of others, the good of the community, hopefully is being done for the right reason, but often it's about obedience, it's about following the rules, and anthems are a way to galvanize people to do that, I think. The militarism of musically of the anthem is really a phenomenon of World War One. So prior to this community singing, where people sang it together, there was actually, in a sense, the Star Spangled Banner was a kind of folk song. Like everybody sang it slightly differently. Not so much the notes and the words, but the rhythms. So in the 19th century, the Star Spangled Banner was sung faster. If you think about Francis Scott Key in 1814, this is a party song. This is a song of victory. It's like, woo, we won, Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what a proudly we hailed. So it's quite quick and upbeat and celebratory. After the Civil War, it slows down because it becomes it becomes sacred, right? It becomes more like you're at church. And so the tempo pulls back to represent the gravitas of the sacrifice of American military. And that connection to the Civil War, to the Mexican American War, to the Spanish American War, to World War One, I mean, has all sort of deepened that sense of solemnity around the anthem and slowed it down. But it was in World War One that the sheet music for the Star Spangled Banner was finally published, and it was published by the U.S. government as a way of saying, okay, basically for school kids, like if you're going to sing this in school, which was done, um, everybody has to sing it together with the same rhythms, because if you sing it with different rhythms, then it's a ritual of disunity rather than unity, right? Everybody has to sing it the same way. And so the sheet music was published. And since it was at that time of World War One, it was a time of particular militance and sort of pernicious patriotism. And so those kind of snapped rhythms, the military dee da da da, that dotted 8/16 if you're a musician, but those snappy, unequal rhythms is partially this kind of militaristic sort of percussive effect, and that was sort of baked into the anthem in World War One and has continued to this day. But prior to that, it was they were often even notes, so you didn't have that kind of rhythmic energy and almost sort of edginess to the tune. So I think sort of the history of the anthem at war is one of the more fascinating things to really dig into, and it's one of the reasons why the anthem remains controversial today, because it seems to be a kind of recruiting tool. If you don't like people killing each other, um, so many world anthems are have a lot of blood on them, right? They're born of these moments of sort of national crisis, and so this is more typical than atypical.
You said there about how it was standardized, but ironically, it's become the opposite now. It seems that many of these major events, the goal is to unstandardize it because you hire somebody to sing the song who is going to make it with varying degrees of success into something very personal. I mean, I mentioned the Whitney Houston one. There was the Jose Feliciano version, which was a completely different take. Uh, and that again seems to be a unique example that you don't find in other parts of the world, where people will try to change the anthem into something that only they can sing in a particular way. It's so what's the history of that? I mean, go back to the Jimi Hendrix thing that you started off with. It's quite extraordinary.
No, that's a wonderful observation. And I think you're right. There is this tension between the individual and the nation that's embodied in the way we sing the song in the United States. And of course, that's sort of the ultimate problem of nation, right? Is how do you get the individual to sort of enter this social compact, to give up some of their individual rights or to compromise their individual needs for the good of others. And I think that's borne out in the way the song is performed. The Whitney Houston version you mentioned, yeah, most people I talk to are like, that's the best version ever. But it's really Jose Feliciano, as you point out, that is the one who sort of opens the door for these very personal takes on the anthem. And that was at the game 5, I think, of the World Series in 1968, which was in Detroit. It was the year after the race rioting in 1967. And so it was a moment where he himself, being having been born in Puerto Rico, was sort of trying to create a soulful anthem that would resonate with young people. And he meant it as a very um, sincere expression of his own gratitude to the country. But of course, the Vietnam War is going on. Students for a Democratic Society is rising. The very controversial Democratic Convention in Chicago had just happened. So there's a lot of social strife, and the relationship of young people to the nation itself is really, really under strain. And so I think Feliciano sort of touches those live wires, and that's part of why his version becomes so controversial at the time, even though he meant it as pretty sincere, uncontroversial statement. But it opens a possibility then for future artists to start doing their own thing with the anthem. I think it's a sort of a dangerous thing for an artist to do. I mean, it's dangerous to sing the anthem. If you mess up the words, you're going to be vilified for sure. If you mess with the music, the judgment of the public really is going to turn on whether it's perceived as sincere or not. So the thing about Whitney Houston is she actually does quite a few individualistic things. There's extra notes, and she flips up to a high note on free, and you know, she sings it in 4/4 instead of 3/4, which for a musician is a pretty radical move. Feliciano does the same thing, but she does it in such a way that rings true with that sort of sacred hymn-like version of the anthem, and it comes off as a kind of gospel hymn. And people heard that, in the course the first Iraq War was going on, first Gulf War was going on at this time. Um, heard that as a kind of very deeply personal expression of love for the country. And so I think that's the question is, if we think of patriotism as love, then the emotion that we can communicate through the anthem becomes really important. And the more personal that is, right, the more it seems sincere. And so I think that's really the question about this. And for me, what's really interesting there is the relationship then of patriotism to protest, right? So is protest seems like it's expression that's often interpreted as hate for the country, right? You don't like it. You don't like the way it is. But you can love something and want to change it, right? And so for me, what sometimes happens is people hear a version of the anthem and they'll ask me a question at a talk. It's like, I heard this terrible version. We should have a law about how to sing the Star-Spangled Banner in the United States. And so we don't have these crazy versions where these pop stars do all this weird stuff. And what I point out to people is, well, if we had a law that said you have to sing the anthem in this one way, if someone sang it in that one way, it would be an act of obedience, right? They would be following the rules. And so how do you tell the difference between following the rules and a sincere expression of devotion to the country? You really can't musically, right? It just becomes indistinguishable. And so the price of the ability to express musically a personal statement of sincerity is the possibility that someone might express something else, right? So protest has to be possible for patriotism to be possible. So for me, they're two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And the history of the Star Spangled Banner is that it has been used in protest and sort of as an expression of dissent throughout its history. But that expression of dissent is ascribing itself to a love of country. So it's an expression. Using the anthem to express protest is also an act of expressing hope, right? That you want the country to change, to be in a different way, and to be better, and to be, in a sense, more lovable, right? So I think that the history of the anthem really is the history of how patriotism and protest interact and work together.
Do you think that that also makes the anthem something that is a living thing as opposed to a static, this is the way you have to sing it? Because it can't be changed and messed with, that gives it the flexibility to succeed and survive?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing about a song versus a flag, because in some ways the Star Spangled Banner is both, right? A flag sort of exists. It's a visual thing. You can hang it on a wall. You can leave the room and come back. It's still there. It doesn't change, right? A song has to be brought to life in the moment through performance. It doesn't exist without sort of inhabiting time as well as space. Even if it's a recording, you have to have a period of attention where you're listening to it. So the way in which the anthem has to be brought to life in performance, I think, gives it this power to respond to what's going on in the world. So when Jimi Hendrix played the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock in 1969, he later, was on the Dick Cavett show, which was like one of the late night shows at the time, and he said, we play the anthem the way the air is today in America. It's slightly static, isn't it? Right. So he's trying to sort of capture the sound of political dissent, of political disagreement, of people who were for the war in Vietnam and against it. And Hendrix himself had a vexed relationship with that because he had been in the 101st Airborne, he had friends in Vietnam, but he's also sort of performing at this cultural, revolutionary concert where young people are sort of saying we're going to remake America in our own way, and sort of celebrating the potential of youth to redefine the nation. So I think his performance at Woodstock is fascinating because it's both patriotic and a vehicle of protest at exactly the same time.
Do you think that countries like the US and other traditionally immigrant countries that use national anthems as a way of creating a sense of national identity, which other more settled countries, like I'm thinking like UK or Germany, don't feel the same need to integrate massive amounts of newcomers into their society? So, is part of the success of a song like the Star Spangled Banner the fact that it it's approachable and that immigrants will use it to prove their Americanness?
No, that's a great observation. I think anthems can be used or abused. So in the abuse category is using it as a weapon to divide people. So, and this is very typical of partisan politics in the United States, that you sing the anthem almost to shout down the opposition, to claim that you're the real Americans and that your opponent are false, are bad Americans in some way. The good use of anthems is maybe to create a sense of community, that says that we're together before we're divided. We may have disagreements, but the need to be a nation together, has to overcome that division. And one of the key things about politics, about democratic societies, is the peaceful transition of power. You have an election, and one side says we won, and the other side says we lost this one, and we're gonna play the minority party role. We're gonna play the opposition role, and you have to agree to accept the results of the election in order to have a nation, really. And the anthem, in a way, in a healthy way, would be a way to sort of emphasize that love of that the whole was more important than the tribal identities that are within the whole. So any nation that has factors that divide it, so immigrant groups that speak different languages, that have different cultural heritages, that are brought together, vast geography, right? So a lot of American patriotic songs are about the sea to shining sea and the sort of the huge expanse of the United States. I think the size of the country, also creates a barrier to being together. And then, a history of social strife. So the Civil War in the United States continues to be a divider. There are a lot of countries, I think, in Europe where there's a large history of ethnic tension and even war between different groups. So any of those things, I think, make the need to come together as a nation, more important. And so I think you're right. Those things do make an anthem more urgent.
You mentioned earlier about how when the song was written and while it was in its perhaps formative stages before it was formalized as a national anthem, that people added extra lyrics to it. That it was this wasn't seen as controversial; it was just seen part of what people did at the time, and it's not unique. Other national anthems have had lyrics that are periodically added and disappear as times change. Should anthems be constantly evolving? Should we go back to that idea that maybe it's time to you know let's update it or add an extra verse in there to perhaps make it more inclusive and address concerns that people have?
I think that would be a fascinating way to approach anthems. I mean, there is a history, as you point out, of anthems having different words. In my research, I've come up with over 580 sets of lyrics that have been sung to the tune the Americans only know as the Star Spangled Banner. And the most popular before key was Adams and Liberty, about President John Adams in 1798. Maybe the most powerful one that I found is a anti-slavery lyric from 1844 called "Oh Say Do You Hear," which very graphically talks about the plight of enslaved people in the United States and draws on the irony of the fact that the land of the free, as Key celebrates with that high note at the end, is actually a land where 4 million people aren't free. So there is a way in which, we look at nations in some ways as they have these kind of historical roots, and there's this sort of permanent sacred truth to them, but in fact they're always evolving and changing. And so, national symbols on one hand have this historical weight. They get their validity in a sense from the accrual of patriotic devotion over time. On the other hand, the nation's constantly changing, so it seems like the symbol that represent it should maybe constantly evolve too. So changing the lyrics would be a really dramatic and healthy way, I think, to do that. For me, the way the music has changed and adapted to different individual expression and different styles, the way sort of Black American music has affected the performances of the anthem, like Whitney Houston's. I mean, it is a small indicator of how that could work. That the music stylistically can expand to express other people. But the word slave that's in the third verse of the Star-Spangled Banner, in the book I talk about different options. One would be to just cut the third verse out officially. Another would be to change the word slave to something else. I'm not sure it'd be poetically great, but you could just have knave in there, and it would at least rhyme, and get rid of the word, because no matter what that word might have meant in 1814, it's very divisive now, and it brings up a history that makes people feel alienated from the country, not welcomed. And so that particular word, I think, is probably something that should change.
And that's an important point, because it's not always what you necessarily believe the anthem is saying; it's what somebody else believes that it's saying. Can be the important thing. You can't tell everybody this is what it means if other people firmly believe it means something differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I point out in the book is that the word slave in early American revolutionary poetry is super common, and it usually refers to being a subject of a king. Right. So in Europe, the British were subject to King George, and King George could tell them what to do, like go fight the Americans or go fight the French, and they had to do that as vassals and subjects of the king. So one of the critical issues of the American Revolution is, there's lots of issues, but slavery and economics being maybe really important too. But who gets to call the shots is the big thing, and by having a democracy, we broke away from the King of England. So this use of the word slave, ironically, to us today, was often used to basically talk about white men who were the only people who could vote, and who were the democratic actors in 1776. So, but after the Civil War and the sort of this fundamental thing that defines American identity, the ending of chattel slavery, how can you hear the word slave and think anything else than it actually refers to enslaved, people of African descent who were held in captive labor in the United States? So I think that word has changed meaning over time, but it means a very specific thing today, and we're still struggling with this question of racial equality in the United States, and for that reason, to do something actively about that third verse and that word would be an inclusive move. It would be a welcoming move for American people of all descents, and so I think that would be a useful thing.
How has your research into the Star Spangled Banner changed how you feel about the anthem? I mean, it started off in very general terms, but now you're at the end of it. Has your relationship changed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in some ways it's deepened. I would say that, I've listened to the anthem many, many more times, to analyze it and write about it. I probably listened to Jimi Hendrix version or Whitney Houston's version, hundreds and hundreds of times each. And I would say I find myself as fascinated by the anthem as ever. And of course, it's the weird performances, the ones that are different, that I find most intriguing. But I think one of the things about the anthem that I've come to really embrace is all of the contradictions and conflicts. So yes, it's been used as a weapon. Yes, it's been used as a tool of unity. Yes, it's been used at times of war to motivate people to kill each other. But it becomes a kind of repository of the American past, in all of its glories, and in all of its moments, darkest moments, I think, of inequity and injustice. And on one hand, changing the word slave in the third verse would be a positive move for today. But one of the things I don't want to have happen is for us to basically sanitize all of our anthems so that they are not connected to our history. I mean, for me, the fact that we have to confront the sort of legacy of slavery in the United States in our anthem reminds us of, you know, when we fell short of the vision of freedom and equality that we hold so dear as a nation and our ideals. And I think, you know, every nation has these same similar ideals, right? That we're going to thrive as a group. And you know, to talk about the moments when we weren't thriving, when we weren't welcoming all, and understanding and remembering that, I think is important. And so, for me, the warts and the blemishes, as well as the moments of courage where people, you know, saved Fort McHenry, you know, where they put themselves on the line and made a decision that you know, as Martin Luther King said, you know, the arc of history did incline towards justice. So you know, I think it's both the good and the bad of the nation. The things we should celebrate and the things our cautionary tales are sort of imbued within our national symbols. And for me, I think the Star-Spangled Banner, if you really think about it and you dig into the history and you acknowledge, you know, all of those moments of, you know, really becomes a powerful tool, I think, of the national memory, but also of national understanding. And the tension of today, to me, is more understandable when you understand the tension of the past, and that this conflict between patriotism and protest has always been there, and it actually could be productive. It could be something that's what drives us together. To me, you know, when you hear protest in the anthem, it's a kind of dissonance, you know, and in music terms, dissonance needs to be resolved to consonance, right? Dissonance is what tells you there's a problem that you need to do something to fix it. And so the fact that the anthem continues to be controversial to me is part of its power.
Mark, thanks very much for talking to me.
Thanks so much, David. It's really been fun for me to have this conversation, and best of luck with your podcast. I'll continue to listen avidly.